Um, I wonder whether we can do a bit of a thought experiment. I want you all to imagine that you're 300 years back, it's still snowing outside, you're sat in the middle of New England in Boston, and all around you is a raging epidemic. There are 844 people who've died already. Some 6,000 people have caught this disease, passing on from one person to another, dying of fever, suffocating almost. And amongst a small group, for some reason, they've managed and been able to survive their exposure to this illness. Now, what is it about this group? Well, this group happened to come into contact with a man who originally came from West Africa, a man called Onesimus, who had been brought over on the slave ships across the Atlantic, and after that arduous crossing, ended up working for a priest called Cotton Mather. And there in 1721, in the midst of this epidemic, in the heart of Boston, Onesimus managed to convince Cotton Mather of the efficacy of inoculation. Here is a man from West Africa, 300 years ago, providing a means for challenging our immune system, improving its response, and enabling it to overcome significant infection and saving people's lives. This West African managed to reduce the incidence of disease amongst the people he inoculated from 1 in 7 people dying of this to 1 in 40. Now that is no small achievement. And at the same time that he was doing this, you could easily wander around the villages of Bengal in eastern India and see men going, or women actually, going from house to house, again, inoculating young children, protecting them from the threat of infectious disease. And the same again could be done in East Asia. And in 1716, whilst she was sat in Istanbul, then Constantinople, at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu managed to see this in action and was sufficiently persuaded to have her 5-year-old son inoculated in 1718, again, 300 years ago. And this is a process that was regular, that was normal, that was routine, that was part of these societies. We see it in West Africa, we see it in the Middle East, we see it in East Asia, all over the world. And that brings me to the point of what is vaccination? So vaccination is a way of enabling your immune system to overcome the challenges that it will face when it is affected by an illness. So giving a weakened form of a disease, a weakened form of an infection, or exposing it to part of a germ, so that when it really meets that infection subsequently, it can mount an effective response and protect that person. And that's what vaccination is. And you'll all be familiar with it from the childhood vaccinations that all young children undergo, and the way that we don't see polio today in the UK, that we don't see diphtheria. And tetanus is not the killer that it used to be less than 70 or 80 years ago. So these are things that work and things that are familiar to us. And I think we should take some security from that this is not something entirely new. Now, let me share my screen with you. This was what Onesimus was preventing. This raging inferno of a rash that goes from one person to another, that transforms healthy children to pockmarked, scarred individuals for life, if they even survive it. And this is what was overcome 300 years ago by this man from West Africa. But let me take you on a journey. And the journey I want to take you on is a journey into the cell, into the very heart of our being. Here in front of us is the unit of life, and here at the middle of it is the nucleus. All around is an impregnable barrier made up of fats called the cell membrane. This double-layered membrane is what holds everything else in. And there's no way in or out of it except through tiny portals with their gatekeepers allowing passage through. And then similarly, there's this membrane around the cell, and you can see the holes here that allow passage from what's inside to the cytoplasm outside. And this is the gift from generation to generation. This is the means that the cell controls its response to the world by commanding how it produces proteins. So imagine it like a vast library with these tiny scripts, these messages being sent out all the way around to these protein-producing factories around the edge. And as that script is read, these factories manufacture proteins that are then used either at the membrane or elsewhere within that cell. But that message, a bit like a letter to James Bond, self-destructs. It disappears within about 48 hours. That message, that mRNA, lasts only a few hours within the cell. So what has this got to do with vaccination? So the two vaccines that we have, one produced by Pfizer and one produced by Moderna, are vaccines that contain bits of mRNA, this fragile molecule that rapidly disappears, and somehow manage to get that into the cell. And the way they do this is by coating it in a lipid layer. That lipid layer comes and collapses into the cell membrane. It doesn't need to go through those portals. It just merges in and like a ghost passed through and into the cell itself, and then disappears. That lipid layer disappears, revealing the mRNA, which makes its way down to the ribosome, and they then produce the spike protein. So what you're getting the cell to do is produce a protein that would normally appear on a virus. And because it's abnormal, because it's not something the cell normally produces, that protein is taken to the surface and shown to the immune system. And you have an immune response and you start producing antibodies. And your immune cells recognize anything that might produce this and would kill it. And then another way of getting it is like the Oxford vaccine does, where it uses a virus that does not replicate. It comes, it infects you, and then introduces this, again, little script that is then made up, used by the ribosomes to produce more of this spike protein. And in that way, produces an immune response. So these are very, very clever vaccines, but they're not entirely new. The Pfizer vaccine has been in research for at least 10 years in one form or another, as has the Oxford one, and then has been, with a sideways shift, used in the current coronavirus epidemic. So knowing that, how safe are they? Over 30,000 people, actually 45,000 people have been vaccinated with these vaccines in the trials leading up to their public use. And today, at least 5 million people have been vaccinated in the UK. And we've not had any reports of severe side effects. We've not had any deaths associated with this. But what we do see and what we expect to see is the immune system responding to this, producing swelling at the site, maybe a headache, bit of fatigue, fever, and nausea. And most of these stop after 2 days. So the vaccine is safe. It follows a well-established tradition. And this is a tradition that communities all around the world have been using for the last 300 years. So one of the main challenges throughout the past year that we've seen is that people can present with coronavirus very, very, very differently. I had coronavirus apparently, and I know that because I've developed antibodies to it, but I never had an illness that was particularly severe and required me to stay in bed, if you like. But the other week, I was sat at the end of the bed of someone who who, despite us giving him large amounts of oxygen, almost 60,000 liters of oxygen a day, was holding my hand and thanking me for the care that he had had because he wasn't getting better on that oxygen. And we knew that they had a limited time on this earth. They were alone. Their wife of 50 years wasn't with them. Their children were nowhere near them. And all they had were the nursing staff and the medical staff and their fellow patients in this 4-bedded bay with oxygen just being pumped in and knowing that they weren't doing well. And for me, that was harrowing. For me, it was an incredible honor to see this gentleman so noble at the end of their life. And that is the problem. We do not know who will become very unwell. And I wouldn't want anyone to be in that position. So I don't think it's fair to expect people to take on this burden by themselves without taking hold of a means that we have in hand where we can safely and reasonably, reliably protect people. And that's the reason why I think we shouldn't allow the virus to rip through our population.